Okay, I'll be back in 45 minutes. Bye.
Awesome. Okay. Hey, hi everybody who's joined in just now. Sorry, we're just having a couple of technical issues with scheduling the webinar. Just give us 5 minutes till we figure it out, and we should be able to get started at about 6:50. My apologies for the delay. A lot of things that we have very few resources if we want to innovate in the plant-based seafood sector compared to people in plant-based meat, plant-based dairy who have a lot of resources, a lot of reports to go through. So I think this webinar would really help you guys understand a lot of things, from a global perspective, the cutting edge in science and technology in the second half of our session, where Sònia, who is the CSO at Kuleana and also a co-founder, so she'll speak a lot to her experience as well in starting a plant-based seafood company and some of their products. So firstly, I'll quickly introduce Jen. Jen manages the expansion of GFI's Sustainable Seafood Initiative, and I think this was one of the resources in our phase 1 in the Smart Protein Digital Lab. So a lot of you might have gone through the Sustainable Seafood Initiative page on our website, the Good Food Institute's website. And basically, her job is to ensure that the Sustainable Seafood Initiative proceeds strategically and with key input and involvement from all the stakeholders in the value chain of seafood, especially in the US and also international markets. Her academic background is in environmental science, environmental economics, and sustainable food systems. And she most recently worked on federal climate policy advocacy in the US. Jen holds a master's degree in environmental management from Duke University, and she has a bachelor's in economics and environmental studies from Wellesley College. Welcome, Jen. Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to our, challenge participants today. I'm sure that there are 5-page proposals that they are supposed to turn in a couple of weeks. They are going to do a great job because of this webinar.
Great, thank you. I will share my screen. Does that look good?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Well, I am going to talk a little bit about the plant-based seafood landscape. A lot of my work is in the US, but I do try to keep a pretty global lens on things. So I'll try to make sure that I'm not too US centric in this talk. But please just keep in mind that some of the market considerations that I'll talk about sort of in the latter half of it are pretty focused on the US, and I'll kind of expand the view where I'm able. So today I'm going to talk sort of through a few major sections. So first we're going to talk about global demand for seafood, why we expect it to be, continuing to go up in the next few decades, and talk a little bit about where the plant-based seafood industry sort of comes into play in being able to solve some of the problems with conventional seafood industry, just to kind of set up why there's so much excitement about this space and why it's really awesome that you all are interested in this. And then we'll talk about sort of where plant-based seafood is right now, as I mentioned, in the US, but also around the world, and a little bit about sort of investment trends and recent announcements of partnerships and how we're seeing the industry kind of develop. I'll also talk briefly about some consumer insights we have at this point, though we are just beginning some more research in that space, and then wrap up with a little bit of insight into what the white spaces in this industry are. So why should we care about the development and commercialization of plant-based seafood? It has a lot to do with demand. So first, we know that population growth will continue in the coming decades, and it'll be strongest in areas with the lowest incomes. So this is data from the UN showing, see those teal bars kind of showing how fast we expect population to grow by the middle of the century. And then if we pair that with this look at projected income growth, which is World Bank data, we see that the income growth is pretty concentrated in areas which are currently the lower GDP regions of the world. And so we're seeing that rapid growth, those blue bars on top, compared to much slower income growth in the purple bars below, which are the higher GDP regions. And so if we put these two ideas together, we're seeing that income is growing in places where population is also growing. And because we know that animal protein consumption goes up with income growth, we're expecting a pretty significant increase in demand for seafood, really on a global scale. And that's from a slight per capita increase in consumption, but really the demand is being driven by this population income growth that we could see as much as a 30% increase over the levels 10 years ago within the next 10 years. So that's really, really fast growth without a lot of room to meet it at this point. So what is the plan for meeting that demand? Right now, if we look at where the supply is coming from, I'll talk a little bit about this in the coming slides, but we have wild capture fisheries, the blue section at the bottom of this World Resources Institute graph, and then we have aquaculture on the top half. And because we know that we're sort of at our limit with how much seafood we can really get out of the ocean, we know that it's going to be pretty difficult to increase that blue section, and we actually expect it to go down a little bit in the next 20, 30 years. And in order for us to meet this growing global demand, which is projected on this graph, we would really have to have aquaculture grow pretty significantly in the next 30 years. And a recent study from the Food and Agriculture Organization found that only 17 countries around the world are really expected to be able to keep up with that growing demand using aquaculture. There are just a lot of barriers to the growth of that industry, which aquaculture as a whole can be on land, farming of fish, but also mariculture, the kinds of aquaculture that happen in the ocean. There are just a lot of barriers to continuing to grow it and to kind of keep that process accelerating. And so we're really, that kind of growth of aquaculture on the graph there is pretty unlikely or really challenging and definitely difficult to do in a sustainable way. And there was just a recent study last month about sort of under what conditions can we grow the current seafood supply sustainably if we assume a global population of 9.8 billion by 2050. And the authors kind of looked at supply curves and said, okay, we can get there if we have improved fishery management, reformed mariculture policy, if we advance feed technology and fed mariculture, so basically moving away from wild-caught fish being used in aquaculture systems, and if we maybe have shifts in demands and consumers are demanding different types of seafood than they currently have. And all of those sound like reasonable solutions, but they're actually really challenging, and those are things that a lot of advocates in the space and governments in the space have been working on for a long time without a lot of luck. So we really think that this is the time to think about a new solution, and I think that's why you all are here and why you're thinking about plant-based seafood and alternative seafood generally is really sort of our best shot at continuing to meet demand in the most sustainable and healthy way. And so at the very least, being able to kind of meet that extra growth with this industry is really exciting in terms of expanding our food supply sustainably and healthfully in a way that's really just to everyone. So what are these specific examples or advantages of alternative seafood production? As I mentioned, we have two main ways of meeting seafood demand at this point: wild capture fishing, so going out, catching fish from the ocean or freshwater resources, and then aquaculture, just farming fish. Aquaculture also typically refers to the farming of sea plants as well, but what I'm mostly talking about here is fish and shellfish. And there are a lot of concerns with wild-caught seafood, which the primary one people know of is overfishing. So there are just limited numbers of fish in the ocean, and we know that there are about 7% of fisheries on the entire planet that are underfished. So that's kind of where we could get more fish, more shellfish. Really, though, we have a good amount of fisheries that are overfished already that we really need to cut back on, and then many that we think are currently being fished, about 2/3 of the fisheries around the world currently being fished to their maximum sustainable yield, which is good if we're, sure that that's right, but obviously does not get us any closer to that growing demand. There's also a lot of concern about fuel use in fishing. So as sort of coastal fisheries have become depleted and how fishing vessels have gotten larger and gone further and use more sort of larger gear on the fishing vessels, we're using a lot more fuel. And there's been a pretty significant increase in the greenhouse gas emissions associated with wild capture fishery in the last few decades, really since about the 80s. Fuel use has gone up a lot, and that's really on a global level. In addition, bycatch, which is the unintended catch of birds, turtles, sea mammals, juvenile fish, any really non-target species, by some estimates comprises about 40% of everything that's caught around the world. So a huge amount of waste and unnecessary catch is happening just because, fishing is not a super precise activity, and it, from the incentives of the fisher, it makes sense to kind of catch everything quickly and throw out what they don't want. So that obviously creates huge issues for ecosystems and is a pretty wasteful way of obtaining food. And then finally, there are other habitat damage components in addition to bycatch. So we know that coral reefs, for example, harbor a huge amount of our ecosystem diversity in just a really small portion of space on the ocean floor, and they can really be pretty significantly damaged by bottom trawling activities, which is a pretty common fishing method. So just a wide range of concerns having to do with the way that fish are being caught now and with trying to get more fish out of the ocean. And we also know that there are, concerns with aquaculture, even though it has grown a lot in the last few decades to try and meet this growing demand. This is the sort of summary of a report from FAIR, which is a global investor network that's really focused on opportunities for responsible investing in the protein space. And they looked at sort of these 10 major short, medium, and long-term risks of aquaculture and of making these sort of big investments in the space. So these short-term risks are anything that could, sort of have an impact in the next couple of years, or could really have an impact now. And one example of that is the prevalence of disease in aquaculture, where these producers with major aquaculture farms are consistently losing large portions of the animals that they're raising just due to disease passing so quickly among these ponds of very similar animals all living together. The medium-term risks they talk about are sort of those that will have an impact in some but maybe not all systems, or that are going to have an impact in the next year or so. And that's everything, community resistance. There are climate risks and impacts of climate on the food supply from aquaculture. And then they talk about longer term risks, which are really they're talking about 4 or 5 years out, so not super long term, but that includes things like shortage of feed supply and are really estimated to be a pretty serious issue pretty soon. And I also wanted to take just a quick second to talk about greenhouse gas emissions with seafood. So we've kind of come to understand that terrestrial animal production is associated with pretty high greenhouse gas emissions. I think that the seafood industry gets away with not having that reputation, but these are the results from a pretty recent report from SINTEF, which is a large independent research organization based in Europe. And the authors compared the average emissions of several seafood species produced and consumed in Norway. And so if you look at this graph, you can see that salmon and shrimp emissions are sort of in between pork and poultry. And then if we kind of zoom in and compare everything to pork, then we see, there's not a huge benefit of a few of these species against pork in terms of emissions. And these emissions, as I mentioned, from wild capture fisheries are really coming from fuel use. And on the aquaculture side, they're primarily from the feed. So not just the wild caught feed that comes in, but even the plant-based feed that's going into some of these like more innovative aquaculture systems involves not only, land use change to grow the crops that are then being fed to animals, but also, the transport and processing of a lot of feed for animals. And the other sort of, issue that seafood kind of gets away with on the aquaculture level is this issue of feed, where feed conversion ratios are often touted as being really efficient. And so that's the question of sort of how efficiently a kilogram of feed that you give to an animal becomes a kilogram of biomass on that animal. But this 2018 study looked instead at the protein and calorie efficient. So how many calories go in to get a calorie of actual edible fish, or how many kilograms of protein go in order to get a kilogram of protein of actual edible fish. And all of these species were a lot less efficient than people thought, and they're actually pretty similar to a lot of land-based animals. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there are all of these different levels in which plant-based seafood can have a pretty massive advantage over the current conventional seafood industry. So now that we have a sense of why we would do this from the more altruistic perspective, I think I'll talk a little bit about some of the economic efficiencies, but also about where the industry is right now. So when we talk about alternative seafood, we really mean not just plant-based, but also fermentation-derived seafood and cultivated seafood, so the products made directly from cells. But obviously today we're going to focus on the plant-based side, though there are these other two categories that are growing as well in the alternative seafood space. And as I mentioned, there are more efficiencies than just the feed efficiency or just the more social and environmental factors. So if we put all of that aside, there are still huge advantages to getting into plant-based seafood. And that's a lot because the industry can be more demand driven than conventional seafood, which is very supply driven, very based on what people are able to catch, what's going well in aquaculture, whereas there's a lot more control possible in this industry. So the production process for plant-based seafood is much more controllable and predictable. That allows just for better, quicker, real-time response to demand changes, and being able to place production facilities close to demand. And so that allows, the reduction of transportation costs and, the sort of reduction of logistical challenges in getting fresh seafood to a consumer from a production center. And then third, we can do, get more valuable cuts, better product formats, all of that without sort of generating these low value byproduct wastes. So we're able to kind of increase the efficiency, which, creates opportunity for plant-based seafood products to, provide a healthier and ultimately less expensive option than conventional seafood. And finally, we can, prevent the waste in other ways too. So at least in the US, nearly half of all seafood is thrown away from, bycatch, but also consumer and producer food waste and distribution spoilage. And that is, continuing to be an increasing issue in other places as well. But and that's a lot because, conventional seafood is highly perishable. But we are fortunate that, plant-based seafood often has a longer shelf life and can be, as I mentioned, produced closer to where consumers are. So we expect less waste and sort of a more streamlined process with being able to, pursue this more, much more efficient matter of production. So the big plant-based seafood products that are on the market right now, these are the three that make up most of the sales in the US. So they are, the frozen section products. They are sold with other plant-based products. They're not, sold next to other frozen seafood products, but they are pretty popular among people who are, currently interested in this. They just don't, necessarily expand at this point out to a wider consumer base than maybe your vegans, vegetarians, flexitarians who are interested in plant-based products generally. And so these are the top three in the US, which may be different in other regions. And I should mention the corn products are, obviously that's a fermentation technology company, but they're often sort of lumped in with the plant-based category, at least in this regard. So Gardein and corn sort of have for at least 10 years had a little bit of the market cornered in terms of plant-based seafood. But we're starting to see a lot more happen. So these are kind of the startups that have launched in the last 4 or 5 years or so. And I'll talk about a few of the even newer ones. This list is obviously not exhaustive, but these are some of the ones that have come up just in the last few years. And they're definitely sort of making consumers rethink what plant-based seafood is and who it's for. So we have Sophie's Kitchen, which was founded in 2011, and it's the maker of several plant-based seafood products, including breaded shrimp, shelf-stable tuna, and smoked salmon that are made from cognac root and seaweed. So they're often in the frozen section and have some shelf-stable products. New Wave is a plant-based company that was founded in 2015 and produces shrimp primarily made from seaweed and other plant ingredients. And I'll talk a little bit about this later, received funding from Tyson Ventures, which is pretty cool to have the conventional protein industry interested in them. Good Catch was founded in 2015. They're the maker of plant-based shelf-stable tuna, plus some frozen appetizers, including crab cakes. And Good Catch just built and launched a brand new, pretty large manufacturing facility in Ohio in the US, so in the middle of the country, where they're able to really start to expand their production. And then Ocean Hugger, which you may have heard was sort of off the market, but is relaunching coming up soon, is they use biomimicry to sort of turn whole vegetable ingredients into something, a vegetable version of sushi products. So they have their, savory umami, which is their eggplant product that is sort of replicating eel. And they are primarily in the food service space. And then there are even newer ones. So just in the last year or so, we've seen 4 or 5, maybe 6 new startups. We'll hear a lot more about Kuleana, which is producing plant-based tuna using algae and plant ingredients and doing a lot of work on sort of the texture side. So I won't get too into them because you'll be hearing from them in a few minutes. But we have Hooked, which is based in Sweden and really working on these shredded plant-based products. They're really adding, the seaweed for added flavor and also omega-3 fatty acids. And the products are expected to launch in food service pretty soon, and then eventually hopefully expand to retail and to other countries. The plant-based seafood company is a pretty interesting story. This was a recent spin-off of a conventional seafood company in the United States. So, small family-owned company in Virginia was making seafood, saw demand for plant-based seafood and launched a line and eventually spun it off into this whole company because of massive interest in their plant-based products. So they've just recently become a separate company. And then Legendary Fish is another one of the new ones, which is an Austrian startup working on applying 3D printing technology to salmon fillet kind of product. As I said, this list is not exhaustive. This is just a few of the exciting developments, and not pictured here, but worth noting is also a longtime plant-based company, Upton Naturals, which is launching sort of a plant-based whitefish fish finger product made from banana blossom, which apparently mimics the texture of a whitefish very well. And I just wanted to mention that these companies are on a fairly global scale. Obviously, there's some concentration in the US and Europe at this point, but there is this understanding that seafood is a fairly regional thing, and markets have different consumer preferences depending on where you are. So there's a good amount of opportunity in a lot of different regions. So I think that the more that we see this continuing to evolve and expand around the world, the better. But I did want to note that it's not all completely concentrated in like Silicon Valley at this point. So where is the market in terms of size? So as I mentioned, we have market numbers for the US, but hopefully, some of this is still helpful. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of where plant-based seafood is, and then where conventional seafood is, and then what we think consumers are thinking about this space. So if we look at US retail sales, this is from SPINS, we see that plant-based seafood was just shy of a $10 million category in 2019. So that means it's about 1% of all plant-based meat. So really small portion of a market that is growing fast and has a lot of excitement, but is still relatively small. So there's a lot of room for this market to grow and to become something, you know, as big as plant-based meat, and then to kind of continue to grow with that market and become, you know, a significant portion of the seafood industry writ large. So to kind of put that number in perspective, this chart breaks out plant-based meat sales by animal product. So including seafood, you can see that, you know, beef, chicken, pork make up the majority of sales, and seafood is comparatively quite small. It's, you know, pretty hard to see the bar there. And another way of visualizing that is looking at this comparison between animal-based meat sales and plant-based meat sales by animal product type. And you can see that, you know, fish and shellfish make up about 20% of the overall animal-based meat market. But then once you look at the plant-based meat market and the breakdown, there's really, you know, you barely can see any chunk of that. That's that sort of 1% mark. So there's considerable opportunity to kind of meet sort of a reflective demand of what's in the animal-based meat category in the plant-based seafood category. And to kind of highlight that opportunity, we can look at retail sales of conventional seafood. So this is both wild-caught and farmed seafood, which are about a $15 billion industry total in the US in retail, and finfish accounts for about half of that, and then shellfish with sort of the all other seafood, you know, mixed seafood products, things that aren't necessarily neatly in one category of species, accounting for the rest. So it's a pretty big industry overall, the, you know, conventional seafood space. And then within that, within finfish, sales are highly concentrated among just a few product types. So we really see, you know, salmon and tuna kind of keeping a pretty significant share of the market, tilapia, cod, catfish kind of coming in after them. But, you know, we have almost 70% of the market being covered just by salmon and tuna. And then on the shellfish side, there's a pretty clear dominance, and this is a pretty global trend as well, of shrimp. So that's why we've started to see such a big interest in shrimp from the alternative seafood industry. I think there's still plenty more room for others to get involved in that, just because it's such a huge portion of the market, and there are a lot of different product types within that you know, species group as a whole. So you have the battered and fried shrimp, you have shrimp, processed shrimp going into other added value products. You have shrimp going in like a, you know, a fresh shrimp cocktail product. So there's a lot of room still there, and it's just a massive, massive industry. And so if we kind of think about these last two slides together, I think there's a lot of room in shrimp, but also salmon and tuna to continue to, you know, grow, especially if we think about the kinds of things that are sold in retail, which at this point is, you know, a pretty significant chunk of overall seafood sales, whereas pre-COVID food service sales of seafood were more significant. And we're starting to see that incumbent protein companies are getting really interested in plant-based seafood and alternative seafood broadly. And this is, you know, not surprising given the size of this market opportunity and the fact that it's become pretty clear that there's going to be a role for alternative seafood in the market going forward. So we're both seeing conventional seafood companies get involved, but also meat companies who haven't traditionally seen a role for themselves in conventional seafood, but do see, you know, that they can kind of match their plant-based terrestrial focus or their other focus with plant-based seafood, which is more aligned with their current production than necessarily, you know, conventional seafood. So we're seeing there are a lot of advantages to this for companies. One that we hear a lot about is sort of broadening consumer bases. So consumers are able to, companies are able to create products that appeal to a wider set of consumers than they, you know, normally appeal to, including younger generations, people who are looking for, you know, more sustainable options, sort of the, you know, more ethical protein sources. then we're also able to, see this expansion of alternative protein portfolios that helps advance commitments from companies to sustainability. So companies have these corporate sustainability goals, and they're able to enhance that with plant-based products. And so having another option like plant-based seafood is another way for companies to get there. And then diversifying, supply chains is always helpful for companies. They're expanding outside of, their wild caught or their farmed or their terrestrial meat production in order to sort of better position themselves to withstand supply and demand shocks going forward. So a few of these examples of sort of big existing incumbent companies getting involved is most recently Nestle launched a plant-based tuna product called Luna. This was just in the last few weeks. They'll be launching it under their Garden Gourmet brand, and that will be a product that is sold both in sort of a glass jar on its own, but also in prepared sandwiches. And you can see this quote from their chief technology officer really highlighting the fact that sustainability was behind this decision, that they want to have a role in reducing overfishing and protecting biodiversity in the oceans. And Nestle has in general been pretty outspoken in wanting to develop plant-based proteins to kind of enhance their sustainability story. We also, as I mentioned before, saw Tyson Ventures, which is the venture arm of Tyson, the major meat company in the US, invest in New Wave Foods last fall. And that really came down to the Tyson Ventures CFO trying the product and just being impressed by the flavor and the texture and saying, I think that consumers will be interested in this. And that was really the selling point for them was, once they had the product and they could tell that it would be compelling to a pretty wide range of their audience and wouldn't just, target the vegans among their consumers. And then, as I mentioned, Van Cleve Seafood launched their plant-based shrimp and plant-based crab cakes in a new line last fall. And then after, they were pretty successful, they launched into this new company. And they recently just, after spinning that company off, won an award that called them the sort of most disruptive product of 2020, which is pretty exciting. And as you can see here, a lot of why they did this, why they spun off the company, but also why they produced a plant-based product in the first place was this desire to appeal to a wider set of audiences and to really get the younger consumers, younger parents who were concerned about conventional seafood to try some of these products that were more ocean inspired, but really match the sort of sensory experience of the conventional products that they were used to. And then also in the last few months, Bumble Bee Foods announced a joint venture with Good Catch. So Bumble Bee is about 100-year-old, more than that, 120-year-old conventional tuna company. They've been one of the longstanding US brands of canned tuna that has been in the center of the supermarket for over a century. And they became interested in the plant-based space pretty recently, and they are leveraging their experience to help Good Catch, which is owned by Gathered Foods, to expand their distribution and increase their manufacturing capacity, and also work to sort of align the two brands in terms of marketing and consumer outreach. And as you can see here, their talking points on it are pretty focused on this, idea of adding a more sustainable product to their line and being able to kind of allow their consumers to enjoy this ocean inspired, or as they often call it, ocean loving products without, having the impacts on the ocean that their conventional products might. So I just wanted to quickly note some of the investment trends in this space. This is actually for both plant-based and cultivated, but I think it's a good way to see, how the interest is driving from other sort of ocean investments into alternative seafood. So we have this overview of investment activity for both the categories. And as you can see, just in the, first chunk of 2020, we're almost at the 2019 levels. And that number has been increasing pretty steadily. The 2019, that $41 million investment number is pretty dominated by Blue Nalu's raise of $20 million last year, which was at the time the highest funding raise for the entire cultivated meat category, though it has been since surpassed by the massive Series B from Memphis Meats. But really the trend is going in the right direction, and I think we're going to see more and more of this going forward. And a couple of, the investors sort of more traditionally either not in the ocean space, but in alternative proteins broadly, or in the ocean space and not looking at alternative proteins yet, have started to get into this space. So just a few weeks ago, S2G Ventures, which is a climate change, planet health, agriculture, kind of focused impact investment fund that has invested in Beyond Meat and a lot of other on the terrestrial side, launched an ocean and seafood strategy. And as you can see, they have specifically mentioned that they will be looking at alternative protein in the seafood category. And notably, one of those two managing directors mentioned in this article, Larson Metter, is a really long time sort of figure in the conventional seafood industry. So we'll be seeing, I think, increasing links between alternative seafood and conventional seafood, which will help to continue to grow the industry and create opportunities for new startups to get that kind of help and guidance from the existing industry and sort of break into the broader consumer framework that maybe wouldn't be available if there weren't those links between the two sides of the industry. Similarly, Hatch, which is a traditionally a sustainable aquaculture investment fund, has actually recently sort of rebranded themselves as Sustainable Aquaculture and Alternative Seafood, and they just announced their 2020 cohort, which includes that company that I mentioned before, the plant-based seafood company, which had spun out of their conventional family company. So a lot of excitement there. That will be a, I believe, 16-week incubator program, but really exciting to see an incubator and a fund that was really founded with the focus on aquaculture and growing seafood sustainably to now be, explicitly categorizing alternative seafood as within that category. So finally, I just wanted to run through some consumer insights that we have so far and a little bit about where we think the market is going to go. So, as I mentioned, we have primarily US data on this, but I think there are some really interesting insights and we'll continue to do some research to expand this globally. We did do a extensive review of the academic literature in this space and found that in general, conventional seafood is consumed for health reasons, be it for, habit or sort of cultural practice reason, and because of taste. So nothing super surprising there. The literature also points to major barriers to conventional seafood consumption being, perception that it's difficult to prepare. Price is a big one. And then, social settings where people live in a household where others don't like seafood. And then this bottom graphic is from the FMI Power of Seafood report from 2018. And it looks at sort of some of the top reasons that people talk about buying seafood. So we have product quality, taste and flavor, type or species, some of those more sort of product attribute focuses, but then a good amount of the respondents cited some form of either price or price per pound as being important in their decision-making process for creating seafood or for purchasing seafood. So we both need to kind of think about the quality of the product moving forward and making sure that we're creating products that really meet the sensory expectations of consumers, but also finding ways to keep the prices manageable because the conventional seafood industry already struggles, especially in the sort of fresh and side of the industry with getting products to the price where consumers feel comfortable purchasing them. So we have conducted a little bit of preliminary research and we're just launching a fuller study now that unfortunately won't be done for a couple of months. But we surveyed 1,000 consumers in the US on sort of why they might be interested in trying plant-based seafood. And as I said, we'll be doing more research on these questions and refining the questions, but these are some preliminary results that I think are fairly expected, but we are interested in seeing how our expectations are reinforced. So personal health came out as the primary reason, and this is across all the 1,000 respondents as a reason why someone would want to try plant-based seafood. But sustainability and taste and animal welfare, all of these issues also came up pretty high across the broad range of respondents. Then when we kind of split out the respondents between people who identified as flexitarians, so people who primarily eat a vegetarian diet but not fully, or are trying to eat more vegetarian, versus the broad category of respondents, we see that health, sustainability, animal welfare, and that global food security issue really are more important to the flexitarians in the sample than to the broad sample overall. And so it'll be interesting to see if those findings are reinforced as we continue to do confirmatory research. We also asked a question early in the survey saying, are you trying to reduce your meat intake? So these results are split between people who said, yes, I'm currently trying to reduce, or no, I'm not. And we see a pretty similar trend as to the people who identified as flexitarians, where personal health is really important, but also some of these more like altruistic reasons to purchase plant-based seafood, such as sustainability, animal welfare, global food security. So we expect that there to be a pretty significant segmentation of consumers based on what their interests are. And this also kind of, I think, speaks to how we might communicate the benefits of plant-based seafood over time. And then we also saw that cost was pretty important. So these are categorized responses that were initially an open answer questions. So we just, for people who said they were not interested in plant-based seafood, we asked why not, and they typed in whatever answer came to mind. So expensive was the primary one, and then very close to that was that they just didn't expect it to taste as good as conventional seafood. So as I mentioned before, with sort of the big trends in conventional seafood consumption, there is sort of this dual mandate of creating both delicious products that really meet that sort of nostalgic sensory profile of conventional seafood, but also this need to make sure that products are sold at a price that's reasonable to consumers, because they're pretty price sensitive when it comes to seafood. And then finally, flexitarians reported those cost and accessibility barriers at slightly higher rates than other consumers. So the sort of question of I don't know where to buy it came up more as the type of response that a flexitarian would give than other respondents. So it'll be important to think about getting products into stores in similar areas and similar departments to conventional products, and not just in like the vegan category or just at specialty stores, things like that. So finally, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some of the white spaces in the industry as you kind of think about where you might make an impact here. The opportunity, as I mentioned, is huge. And this is, if we think about sort of what proportion of the market in the US plant-based milk currently has, which is a pretty significant chunk of the market, and think about how much we could grow plant-based seafood to meet it, we're seeing that we have a huge amount of growth opportunity. So this $141 million opportunity in the space. What are the big white spaces? So first, humans eat 200 to 300 different species of aquatic animals. So there are companies working on a handful of those, but there is obviously a lot more to do. And we can kind of continue growing the number of species and the number of product formats for all of those. So we're not seeing at this point, plant-based companies with products on the market for squid, clam, lobster, all of these other species that just haven't even really been explored yet, which is really exciting, especially if you keep in mind the fact that there are multiple product forms and different techniques that can be used for each of those. There's just a really wide open space to explore whatever is most interesting and most important to whatever market you're targeting. Second, most of the plant-based products on the market right now are sort of ground, minced, more breaded products, but seafood is often consumed as a fillet. And so we're starting to see a little more action on this side, but I think we could do a lot more on this, especially with the plant-based need for products to be on the like healthier side, or at least perceived as healthy. So if you think about the importance of that, getting those kind of fillet products will be really important. And then finally, we have, very few products that are currently sold in the fresh refrigerated category. So as I mentioned, the plant-based milk has had a lot of success in the fresh category. Plant-based meat, as burgers have moved into that category, have kind of started to be seen by a wider range of consumers. So getting those products out of the like veggie section and into the broader seafood space in the store will be really important. So I think that'll be a good target for companies as they continue to release in retail. So just a few points in summary. One, plant-based seafood is a massive opportunity. Huge way to sort of meet this growing demand for protein, growing demand for seafood specifically, in a really just, healthy, sustainable way. Second, the industry is really just beginning to pick up speed. I think there's a lot of excitement about it. There are investors and incumbent companies coming into it, but there's definitely, we're at kind of this sweet spot where there's excitement, but not as much being supplied from the startups or conventional companies in this space. So it's sort of the perfect time to get into this industry. Third, as I mentioned, there are just hundreds of white space opportunities still to create products that haven't even really been started yet. And then fourth, we sort of need to meet those consumer needs on health, taste, texture, but also price, which is particularly important in seafood. So that is all that I have, and I can stop sharing my screen and turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Jen. I think you covered them despite of us starting a little late. And thank you so much for giving us such deep insights into the entire landscape. It has been super helpful, and I'm sure people have a few questions that they can put in through the Q&A box, and we can take it at the end of the presentation today after Sonia's. Thank you so much. Welcome, Sonia. Welcome for your presentation. I'm just going to quickly introduce you so that, and also give you some context, right? So basically, we have this inspiration webinar series as part of which we have arranged a plant-based seafood workshop, and currently we have about 70 to 80 people who have enrolled into participating into the plant-based seafood category. Which is usually, which was a surprising thing for us, because previously we have seen a lot of traction in plant-based meat and plant-based eggs and plant-based dairy categories. And out of the 500, about 70 of them signing up for plant-based seafood was heartening. And I was just telling Jen earlier that a lot of them had a request that, there are a lot of resources for plant-based meat and plant-based eggs globally, and we can look through market reports, and this is not enough, science or companies to take inspiration from when it comes to plant-based seafood. And so we thought having Sonia would be a perfect, opportunity for all of us to kind of learn from her first-hand experiences in creating a plant-based seafood company. So I'm just going to quickly introduce Sonia. So Sonia comes with a lot of background in food science and technology from University of Barcelona. And she also has a master's in food biotechnology from Girona University. And she's been involved in the food sector for about 15 years from a R&D and marketing perspective. She obviously is a proponent of sustainability, health, and ethics in all the companies that she's worked. And previously, she has worked in academic and industrial settings, in a food science and technology kind of a theme throughout her career. Currently, she's obviously the CSO and co-founder at Kuleana, and Kuleana is basically making plant-based seafood. And we are going to see a lot of nice insights about what their company does, and in general about the science and technology that goes behind product development for plant-based seafoods. So welcome, Sonia. Welcome on this workshop, and you can start your screen share and your deck.
Thank you, Shardul, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here.
So just a quick announcement for all the attendees. After this session, we'll have the Q&A session, and we'll extend the webinar by about 15 minutes because we started a little late. Thank you.
Okay, can you see it? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna bring you some insights on new product development in the plant-based seafood alternatives. And oops. Yeah, so that's me. When I was a kid, about me, I've always been like very, very close to the animals, like feeling compassionate about them, and most of the time feeling closer to them than to people. So that's why at some point I decided that my mission in life was trying to do something to help them. And well, my background, as Shardul explained it, is in food science and technology, but I also did a degree in human nutrition. And I finally did my master's degree in food biotechnology. And I've been like 15 years in the food industry, working at different R&D departments, like starting from big companies, doing internships at Nestlé, for instance, but also doing some years of academic research in University of Girona for 3 years. And then after that, I also worked. So my first experience in the startup world was at Natural Machines. That I was there for 5 years. I was not founder, but I was employee, like the first employee that they hired. And what we did is developing one of the first 3D food printers of the world. So it was quite a cool experience for me. And it was like 5 years ago that I decided to put all my focus in developing plant-based alternatives to meat and fish products. And well, yeah, it was 1 year and a half that we decided to create Kuleana together with Jacek Bruce, that is my co-founder and CEO of the company. So what we do at Kuleana is that we develop next generation plant-based seafood. We use plant-based ingredients and also biotechnology. And our first product is Kuleana Akami, that it's a product that mimics tuna akami. So what we have done, it's a product that is shaped into a loin shape. And then the purpose is that this way it can be very versatile, meaning that every chef can prepare different dishes with the product, going from poke dishes to several types of sushi preparations. For instance, yeah, you can do like from tartar or sashimi, or you can do also maki rolls, nigiri. So that was the purpose, that we could do something that chefs later could play with and prepare different things. Why tuna? So we realized that bluefin tuna species, both Atlantic and Pacific, were critically endangered. That's from one side. Then in general, we were very aware of the overfishing problem, that there's not enough fish in the sea. And specifically talking about tuna, it's that farming is not efficient. So other kinds of fish maybe can be farmed, but in the case of tuna, it's not efficient. It's very difficult to do it. So that from one side. And then also there is the health problems related to tuna consumption, right? We have the heavy metals accumulation, mercury, etc., the parasites, the bacteria overgrowth, then the presence of microplastics, etc. And then from one side. From the other side, we also knew that, according to Forbes, for instance, plant-based seafood only represents 1% of the total plant-based meat dollar sales, right? It's something that Jen was explaining very well. And it's something that shows clearly that there is a huge opportunity. So, said that, let's start. And where can we start? So I will bring you some little insights on new product development. First of all, we have to create this space for idea generation. For that, my recommendation is that you involve everyone in the team, like from the informatics person to the chef, like everyone involved there, saying their things, whatever, considering anything. So it's a moment to be very open and not judging. So maybe someone will bring an idea that you can think that it's crazy, but you don't have to judge at that moment, because it's the moment to be creative And also it's not the moment to find the final solution of the problem, but it's a moment like to bring ideas. And yeah, after that, after you have like a bunch of ideas, then you have to do the idea screening, that it's choosing what's the best idea, or maybe you can choose 2 ideas, and then start working on a business analysis, like checking if there is something already in the market about that somebody is already doing something similar. If that is the case, if it's in your same country or not, then also if they are doing well or not, if you consider, you see that they have some improvements to be done. So it's kind of doing this analysis, and then also doing like a business case and a business plan, and kind of deciding what will be your market size. Like, will it be my country? Will it be this city? Or I don't know. It's like creating this business plan. And then after that, it comes the funniest part, at least for us, for the food scientists, right? That is a product development. And well, at that moment, we have to do the prototype iteration. And it means that we will have to do like many formulation changes, many different proposals, changes also in processing. And every time that we have a prototype that we are more or less happy with, then we have to go to the end consumer and do a tasting. So we should do as many tastings as possible, because from each one of these tastings, you will receive a lot of good feedback. And the best feedback is not the positive, but it's the negative, because you can learn from this, and you can see if, I don't know, maybe maybe 10 people tasted the product and 5 of them say that the flavor is not salty enough. Then you know that you have this issue, right? And you have to improve that. So my recommendation is to do as many tastings as possible. And maybe it's not necessarily to be done, I don't know, for 20 people every time, but maybe it's just 10 people or 5 people. And the advice also, it's like checking that they are representative of your market, of your buyer persona, let's say. So how do you know if the product is ready to go or not? So there are different methods for that. But speaking in general, you have to decide when it will be a go or no go. So when it will be ready to go or not. And for that, you have to set parameters. So for instance, one that it's very, very easy and simple is that in these tastings that you will be doing for each prototype that you do, there will be a score, right? And you have to do like a global valoration of the product. And let's say that it goes from 1 to 5. Then you can set that it will be go when the average of the end consumer valoration will be 4.5, for instance. And if it's less than that, then it's no go. But if it's more than that, then it's go. If it's this, it's go too. But I said 4.5, but it depends on each company. So maybe you can say, no, in our case, it will be 4.7. Or in our case, it will be 4. So it depends. And there are other parameters also. It's just an example. Okay, so once you have this goal and you decide that your prototype is good enough and you want to bring it to the market, then you do a market test. And for that, normally what you do is like an end consumer tasting too, but you have been also in parallel working with the branding, with the packaging, with everything. And then you put everything together. And at that moment, you go. There are different kinds of doing it, but like focus groups or like, for instance, yeah, it's very similar. But the difference maybe is that in the case of these tastings for the product development, you only are evaluating the product. And when you do the market test, then you are evaluating everything, like the branding, like maybe if you are communicating well or not, if they expected something and then it's another thing. So it's another kind of testing. But then also in the end of the day, it's the same thing. If it's go, then you go to the market. If it's no go, then you reconsider what's wrong and what has to be improved. And talking about improvements, it's not that when it's go, it's finished, because normally you will keep improving the product, and they will show up competitors most likely, and these competitors maybe will have something different that maybe is improved in regard to the product that you have, right? Or maybe there will appear in the market some new ingredients that you would like to implement in your product. Or maybe there are many things that can be improved. So you will have your product there and you will receive feedback from consumers too. And some of them maybe will agree that the product, I don't know, it was not fresh enough, so different things. And from that you will learn and you will keep improving. So it's kind of the never-ending story. Well, now moving to another topic, it's this why mimicking instead of proposing something different? This question is something that many people ask, and well, the truth is that it would be interesting, like bringing something completely new that has nothing to compare with the animal foods, right? With meat or with fish, but something completely new and different. But the truth is that we prefer flavors and textures that we recognize from our childhood, so from our past experiences. And that's like it is. And so considering that, that's why it makes sense mimicking, but also we should start bringing more veggies to our next generations just to make them feel more attracted to veggies instead of these textures and flavors that meat and fish have. Okay, so this is a huge challenge because it's not only mimicking the appearance, it's not only mimicking this mouthfeel, but it's a general mimic, right? And then you have to balance all these aspects that you have to mimic. For instance, maybe you will have a prototype that you will be happy with the texture and the flavor, but then you say, oh wow, my market is complaining about the label. They prefer having a clean label and they don't want to have numbers in the ingredients list. Then, oh wow, I am using them. Okay, I have to reconsider it. Another prototype. Or maybe you say, okay, I'm happy with the texture, appearance, with the flavor, but I have to change this nutrient because my end consumer is asking for, I don't know, a higher amount of protein. And you put this extra amount of protein and then the flavor is not there. Then you have to again play with this formulation and again and again and again until it's balanced. And then it's not only about formulation, but it's also about processing. So in general, the first thing, it's kind of exploring the real thing, like the animal food stuff, structure, the composition, the taste, so how it is. And then once you have done the research, like you have a clear picture of how it should look like, how it should taste, etc., then you should explore and list like the potential ingredients that you could use for your product. And also you should explore traditional recipes, like collaborate with chefs. It's good that you are open to collaborate with chefs, for instance, because they are the ones that know the best how, so what people prefers in terms of taste, right, and mouthfeel. And sometimes as food technologists, we know how to make things in a lab, or we know how to make things in a pilot plant. But then it's good to go to the kitchen with your product, play with it, get involved these chefs that can destroy your product and say, oh, wow, this is not good, you have to change this or that. They know a lot, and it's good that you start from the very beginning collaborating with them. And then also, it's important that you check that the processes that you are using can be scalable, that you can later on industrialize it, because probably you can be using some kind of processes that are interesting, but then it will take for ages until you can bring this to the market. So this is also an important thing to have in mind. Well, I just wanted to put some examples of novel processing technologies for fish analogs. And some of them just the high moisture extrusion. Here you have an example and a scheme. And well, I'm sure that you are already familiar with high moisture extrusion, but basically it's like a twin screw. And then you have like normally 2 or 3 filling barrels, and one is for the dry powders, proteins, etc. Then another one is for the liquids, and then you have also the steam normally. There are differences, but and then inside of the twin screw barrel, let's say, it's where cooking happens. So normally you can have it at 150 Celsius degrees or 180 Celsius degrees, it depends. And the last part is when it's extruded, when you have the pressure, and it's when the coagulation and jellification happens, and then you have, and then you have the cooling die, that it's where it sets everything up, and then it cools down, and you have like the texturization. This is one technology. There is also the quet cell that have similitudes. There are other types of extrusion, cold extrusion, etc. And then there is also the biotechnology that you could think of using. For instance, there is the possibility of creating GMOs that will produce a certain component. For instance, the case of Impossible Foods producing hemoglobin, or the Perfect Day with casein, etc. Or then you also have lab-grown meats, right? Like the example of Shiok meats, they produce shrimp, in lab-grown shrimp. And then you have other types of biotech techniques, such as using enzymes, for instance. But the challenge, or the biggest challenge, is when you are a startup, you don't have enough resources. How can you do it, right? Because you don't have normally an applications lab, so you have to transform your own kitchen, like the kitchen of your apartment sometimes. I have done it twice. So it's not the end of the world. You can do it, you can manage, at least for a time. It's like, okay, it will be this first year, let's say, and then when I will have resources, I will have an appropriate applications lab. And then you don't have a pilot plan, right? So how can you manage? It's a matter of finding the right partners. For instance, if you are using some kind of equipment, then it's a good thing to partner with the vendors. Like they have normally pilot plants themselves, and it's a matter of having keeping the trade secrets with them, and like having a good lawyer preparing you good NDAs, and like making sure that you will be protected, but partnering with these selected groups. Let's say you can also partner with research groups or with universities, for instance. Or also it could happen that you have a supplier, like an ingredient supplier, that has a pilot plant, and they propose you that you can go there and work with them. Because what they will want in the end of the day is that you buy their product, right? So it's like a win-win. Maybe you will be using their pilot plant, but it will be good for them in the end, because if your product goes to the market, then you will be purchasing their ingredient. And then also there is a topic that you will not have resources to build a factory. Then there is the case that you can think of using co-manufacturers. So people that has a factory and that manufactures for third parties. In that case, it's the same thing. You have to have a good lawyer, make sure that the contracts that you do are good and protect you well. But it's a good way to make things happen and not wait until you have the resources. And then also, if you are doing biotech, yeah, it's another big case, right? Because it's a huge investment to have a biotech lab. So it's a good way of doing it. It's externalizing it to a private company, for instance, or partnering with universities too. It's another solution. My advice is that you will be super creative, and instead of getting stuck, find solutions. Like, okay, I cannot do that, but how could I do it? Or what could I do instead? And then talking about the teams. So if you are a startup, how can you create this R&D team? Of course, it don't have to be like a huge team. It will be a small, very small team in the beginning. So the good thing is that you can find people that can complement each other, meaning that it's important that instead of finding, let's say, 2 food technologists that have a PhD in high moisture extrusion, and you have one, and then the other one, maybe it's someone that has experience in working in this food industry or in manufacture, or maybe, I don't know, in another field, and they could complement each other's. And it's very important also to take into account the soft skills, because it's as important or even more important that the people in the team can be empathetic, that they can be good listeners, that they can be easygoing, compassionate, etc. It's as important or more than having a cum laude PhD. So it's the same level of importance. And then also it's a good point that you can think of externalizing or partnering with collaborators, meaning that maybe you don't have to hire a lot of people, but you can find freelancers probably that could work with you. And it's the same thing with the other partners, like being protected, having the appropriate NDAs, and then it's a good way to keep working. And well, that was all from my side. Thank you very much.
Awesome. I think that was one of the best presentations, very contextualized to our audience. And I think everybody in our audience could relate to it, because, this challenge is for candidates under the age of 28. So it's largely early stage startups, or, early stage researchers, or even graduate students from food science departments who are currently participating. And I think a lot of insights that you've woven into your deck would really help these guys think through some of the basic principles of going on about starting a company, in this space. But I think now we can take on some of the more technical questions that are coming in through the Q&A box. And, some of these questions could also be for Jen. So depending on the relevance, I'll just passing to either Sònia or Jen, and then we can take it from there. So I think the first question, which is most upvoted, is around some of the processing techniques to mimic the texture of seafood. And I know you covered some of the techniques around extrusion, shear sill technology, etc. But could you differentiate maybe by throwing in some insights of how is it different from making plant-based meat versus plant-based seafood? Any key things to keep in mind while choosing the technology there to achieving a perfect texture?
Sure. So, well, there are different things to have in mind. For instance, it's the recipe. So it will change from meat to fish analogs. when using high moisture extrusion, I mean. And then also it's the configuration of the twin screw. So in the case of mimicking, for instance, chicken, then it's one configuration. But if you want to mimic fish, then it's another one, because you want to get the layers in another way. And then also, sorry, then also it's about so there are different parameters, so just the temperature, and it makes a huge difference in the end product. So it's also related to the formulation. If you are using a certain amount of protein, then you will need to use a temperature. If it's another one, you have to play with that parameters.
Got it. So just to give you some more context, Sonia, in India, there is not a single high moisture extruder, available publicly, neither at any of the universities, which is the biggest limitation of infrastructure. So given that, are there any other techniques, processing which people can look at for, trying to replicate some of these textures?
Well, there are different types of extrusion also. And also I mentioned about the quet cell. And in that case, I recommend that you learn a little bit of the Wageningen University, because they are super expert in the quet cell. So if you want to learn more about that, I recommend that you go to their website and look a bit what they are doing, what they have been doing.
Incidentally, we actually had a webinar just a week ago with Wageningen University, and they spoke a lot about it. So we are actually sharing the webinar recording now with everyone, and you can watch it by tonight, everybody who's attending, to just get answers to some of these technologies. So there's one more technical question, I think, again for Sonia. Like carbohydrates in plant-based seafoods, are they a limiting factor? This is specific to India, but you can talk more about your market as well. Like increasing the source of carbohydrates versus proteins, is that considered a negative in terms of health implications, etc., by consumers in the market?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because normally we are using more carbohydrates compared to the animal product. And yeah, it's something that not all the end customers are happy with, because they would prefer having more protein and less carbohydrates. But it's something that most companies are doing. It's what I was explaining about this balance of the aspect, texture, mouthfeel, etc. So the plant-based proteins that we have nowadays in the market, normally they are not so easy to work with. And on the other hand, some carbohydrates or some hydrocolloids are super good in terms of texture, right? And so it's hard to just using proteins make these textures and get this final product feeling. And that's why we have normally more carbohydrates than the animal product.
Yeah, I can speak from my limited experience as well. I was working a lot with extrusion and faba beans, and obviously high protein sources. It's very difficult to work with them, so that's why usually carbohydrates are that more. So I'll say it's a fine balance that you have to keep in mind, functionality versus how consumers are going to pursue it. And I think some sort of a focus grouping with few people, maybe at your university, whoever was asking this question, would answer that question a little better once you reach that state of product development. Jen, any views here from any market research per se?
Yeah, I think it probably varies a lot market by market. So I don't think I have a good global perspective on that. But I think those are all good points. Nothing really to add.
Thanks. One more question. Since oil alternatives are nutty, therefore, to what extent would they be compatible with the seafood for our palate? Again, you could answer from your own experiences with consumers of increasing more oil content to give it that fishy flavor. It could be algal oils, but at the same time, they have this limitation of aftertaste of being nutty. So just some insights on that. Sonia, to you,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in regard to the fats, it's a challenge here, as you say, because I think that we all like using algae-based oils, but it's true that we have different challenges when using it. For instance, also the taste is normally strong, and also it can be easily oxidated, so it can bring this oxidation of taste quickly. And so normally you have to use in combination other types of oils or fats. But yeah, for sure, it's important that that you use fats that are healthy also, because in the case that you end up using unhealthy fats, then you will have a problem with the end consumer, because most of them are also worried about the healthy issues.
Got it. And teams who don't have a food scientist in their, team for this submission would probably contact your food scientist friend to understand what are bad fats and what are good fats, just to get some more perspective on it. Next question is about sustainability. Since we are dependent on algae and seaweeds for omega-3 fatty acids and umami flavor, etc., in plant-based seafood products, how sustainable do we think is it going to be to have algal culturing and harvesting, keeping in mind any long-term effects or any other implications which we are currently not accounting for on oceans? Maybe Jen, you could answer this a little better.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, obviously, seaweed as a category is very diverse, so there's a lot going on, and there are a range of sustainability outcomes associated with different production processes. The extent to which I can answer that is just by saying that you can source algae products sustainably. There's a lot sort of going for different micro and macro algae production techniques that are good on a lot of sustainability metrics. So seaweed is a carbon sink, and you can actually have sort of carbon positive production processes there. And it's actually been something that for many years people have been looking to seaweed production as a climate solution, but not really having like a market to which to sell that kind of seaweed. So it hasn't scaled up as a solution like that. It can also grow in varied environments with varied amounts of sunlight. So it's a pretty like low input requirement crop. Obviously, as I just mentioned, it's extremely diverse and there's a range there. But I do think there is a lot of room, and I think there are a lot more companies coming into the like algae cultivation space that are doing it with sustainability really in mind. So looking for those as sort of the suppliers and keeping in mind that there's a lot of great stuff going on, and finding ways to kind of support that industry with the work that you're doing. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but it's great that that's something that you're keeping in mind already. And I think it is really important, if we're going to sell this industry on sustainability, which is such a big selling point of it, that we make sure that all the inputs are kind of adhering to that standard.
Makes sense. Anything to add to this, Sònia?
No, I think it was super insightful, what Jen explained it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give you some more context, this challenge is only focused on 5 categories, right? Plant-based meat, plant-based seafood, plant-based dairy, plant-based eggs, and then obviously some technology ingredient or process solutions that go into facilitating the other 4 categories, again plant-based. So we did not have any cultivated categories in this specific challenge, but after much deliberation, actually we decided to permit the use of marine plants and fermentation derived ingredients, duckweed, macroalgae, fungi, recombinant proteins, because a lot of these times these ingredients are very useful for the plant-based seafood category. So that was one of our major driving decisions actually to do that. That was just for some quick context on what the participants are currently thinking and on what lines they're thinking. So I guess next question is slightly technical and more from a process perspective. We all know about hazard analysis and critical control points, which are important in the processing or process scale up, at a production stage. Are there any specific critical control points that one should keep in mind when dealing with seaweeds, or any specialty ingredients which usually go into making plant-based seafood products? Any insights there, Sònia?
Well, to be honest, I'm not an expert in using seaweed and using like microalgae products. We have these in our recipe and we have been tasting them, but we rely on our suppliers for that. So I just can say this about the oxidation of the oils, right? That when you are using, for instance, DHA concentrate algae oil, microalgae oil, that's what we have, for instance, then it's difficult to handle that in terms of protecting from oxidation and rancidity, etc. That maybe it's one thing. And then also I can tell you, yeah, maybe I can bring some insights. Yeah, no, I was, yeah, well, for instance, when using microalgae, but you already know it about the topic of the coloring and flavors, right? That normally if you are trying to mimic a fish, then you don't expect to find this darkness that normally these products like microalgae based proteins, etc. have. And also about the flavors, it's the same thing, because they normally are fishy, but it's another kind of fishiness. And most consumers don't like that kind of off notes and off colors. And that's something tricky. So it's very difficult to find suppliers, in our case, for instance, to find good suppliers of microalgae concentrates that are neutral in terms of flavor and color. And then in regard to macroalgae, well, it's similar thing. So in that case, you can use them for texturizing, for instance, but they are what they are, right? And you cannot, I don't know, you cannot expect them to suddenly be the same thing or have the same texture that raw tuna has. No, they are seaweed, and you can take advantage of some of them and use them, but you have to balance with other plant-based ingredients always. It's not only using algae or microalgae. I don't think that it's a good solution, at least from my experience.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. I think the next question is for Jen. Can you give some insights into the regulatory issues or limitations of plant-based seafood products around globe? Have you seen any, specific cases or instances where certain ingredients or certain, processing techniques were facing regulatory issues? And this is specific to plant-based side of things.
Yeah, I haven't seen really any significant concerns at this point or heard any issues. I think obviously the question of labeling will be a big one in a lot of areas, as sort of the conventional seafood industry, has concerns about things being labeled with the same like species name that they label their products with. So that's something to keep in mind. Though I think that will vary on a country by country basis. So it's hard to make a global statement on that. Though some companies have, avoided using the word itself, and Ocean Hugger uses kind of made up names for their products, or you have, Nestle using Vuna, which I imagine was particularly strategic to avoid using the word tuna, or tuno, which is another one. So there are, those kinds of considerations that some people are taking, but I think we'll probably learn a lot in the next year or two about where regulators are sort of seeing the labeling issue going. And then I don't think there are a lot of concerns in terms of specific ingredients. A lot of them are fairly similar to, plant-based meat ingredients broadly, but there are some regulatory systems that treat, algae ingredients as color additives, and there may be some concerns with that. But that's something that has not been a big issue for any of the companies in the space that I know of, at least so far.
Awesome. I think even I didn't know a couple of those insights. So this was wonderful to hear. I think next question is for Sònia. Can you talk about the early days of Kuleana, just entering the market, getting those first customers, and what was your distribution strategy? Like, was it through restaurants, or did you go retail? Just some insights on that.
Sure. So in the very beginning, we wanted to do 100% algae-based product. So that's what I was just relating to the last question. And we did this iteration that I was explaining in the talk. And we found that end customers didn't like the product, or they liked the product, but it was nothing to do with tuna. So they said, oh, it's completely different. It has another taste. It has another texture. And so we decided to move to a more open at ingredients scope, and started using different plant-based proteins, different plant-based ingredients. And also we have been exploring different processing technologies, very different. For instance, we have tried using high moisture extrusion, what we decided not to go further at that time. And we have been using different emulsification technologies also. We have been using, I don't know, like freezing systems, like a lot of processing techniques. And yeah, that's what we have been doing during this 1.5 years in terms of R&D. And then in regard to the distribution and like the strategy for going to market, we decided that first we wanted to go B2B, so starting from the restaurants, because as I explained to you, we have decided to do this very versatile loin in order to bring it to chefs so they could play with the product. And for that, it makes sense that the product will be purchased by restaurants, right? And so this is our strategy now, but we are also thinking about doing B2D, so direct to consumer, direct to consumer. And for that, we also have the restaurants in between, right? So it's our strategy. We consider retail, but not now, but in the next stage.
Got it. Yeah, very useful insights. And so there's a very interesting question. Like a lot of people are trying to replicate the texture, right? And other properties, like it has to replicate how it looks. But somebody's asking, what if we focus initially on replicating the flavor and then give the product in a paste format, like tuna paste? Is there a market for such ingredients or such products in the global landscape? Either of you could, just take turns answering it.
I can give a quick answer, which is that I think it probably depends on the product. So there are, some like seafood pastes or, those like minced or, products that don't have a lot of the more delicate texture for, certain species and certain things that are very successful on the conventional side and would probably be successful in plant-based. I think something, like a shrimp paste probably makes sense that is, put into a value-added product. But I don't think that I think texture is really important if you want to be, obviously focusing on some of the sort of biggest products in terms of conventional consumption that don't necessarily typically rely on a paste like that. So you'd really have to look at kind of what market you're targeting. And if you're looking at, a certain product that does involve some kind of paste in it, or if you're looking at, say like a lobster ravioli that might have some kind of a lobster flavor in it, then that could definitely work. But you may be a little bit more limited in, being able to supply to those kinds of producers, but not necessarily having a direct to consumer framework as well.
Makes sense. Yeah. I think next question is again for Sònia. Are there any, so this, I'll tie this question up with a couple of other questions. Your general insights on, preventing texture, flavor, and appearance deterioration, especially if people are looking at longer shelf lives, and also trying to be clean label at the same time. So I know that it's very difficult to achieve both things, but just your tips and your insights.
Yes, it's really difficult. It's a challenge for sure. In our case, we decided to have our product ultra frozen, so that allows us to have like an extended shelf life. So that is one possibility. But in the case that you want to go fresh or another type, then yeah, you have to handle. You have to find a way of doing it properly. There are different ways, like maybe you can play with the packaging, like using modified atmosphere, whatever. There are different methods, but there is something that makes a difference. That we have advantage compared to the animal foods, and it's that we can do, for instance, pasteurization of the product, because if we heat up, we can do it right. And if we are using HME, for instance, then we are working at super high temperatures, meaning that we are killing everything there. So compared to, let's say, fresh fish, then the bacteria charge overload it's very different, and this is an advantage for us, right? And something that we can take benefit of. But for sure, yeah, the clean label thing, it's something that it's a trend, and that's happening now, and people is asking for shorter ingredients lists and not having numbers, and that is something challenging.
Okay, so really quickly getting on to the next question. So are there any insights basically on certain types of protein sources which are suitable for plant-based meat but would probably not work? Like, are there any ways of thinking of what ingredients would fit better for plant-based seafood category, and how can we differentiate them from ingredients which usually go into the plant-based meat category?
Okay, so yeah, I guess that maybe the ingredients range, or the ingredients type that you can use when you are developing plant-based seafood instead of other meat types like chicken, beef, etc. It's normally seaweed or microalgae can have this fishiness that we are talking about, and if you use them properly, like with the right amount, selecting the right ones, then they are type of ingredients that you can use developing seafood alternatives. And in the case of meat, you normally don't use that kind of ingredients. I only can think of them, but really you could do similar formulations and then processing them in different ways. So you could have a chicken-like structure and then a fish-like structure, and not changing so much the formulation, I guess.
So at this point, I mean, you can take a look at the Q&A section. There are a few more questions. Some of them are slightly more scientific, so I'm not sure. Does either of you want to pick a question at this point from the Q&A section? So are there any key primary scientific factors that help differentiate between variations in fin fish taste? Any basic insights could help. Like, I guess the question is coming from a context that if we have to think about these different species of fin fish, are there any common factors that are leading to certain tastes that people should be looking at?
Hey, Shardul, maybe I can. Hi, everyone. This is Varun. Maybe I can answer that to a certain degree. Shardul. Hi, Sonia. Hi, Jen. Sorry, I was caught up with some other meetings, but thank you, everyone, for joining us. Real pleasure to be here. So, as with everything, this is a combination of different things. If you're asking, if you are interested in what are the actual components of flavor and what are the components of taste, those are usually things like amino acids, phospholipids, etc. And with fin fish, it really depends on the type of fish that it is. So certain, obviously, oily fish would have a different set of contributors to flavor profile than other fish that are surviving in perhaps brackish water or river fish, etc. As far as the actual things that then contribute to the expression of those molecules, there is, of course, the genetic component. So different lines or different varieties of a singular fish species might have different ratios or components that contribute to it. There is also the environment in which you're growing the fish, and this is true generally of any crop. So if you're feeding the fish a certain type of nutrient, it might express oiliness a little bit better than if not, right? This is well known in how we raise animals generally. The great overall thing to note here is that characterization of fish and seafood species in general is a wide open space and has not really been done to a great degree from a texture perspective as well as a flavors perspective. And so this is a great opportunity within this entire sphere of alternative proteins.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and kind of answers the question. Are there any key ingredients that people could use? And they could be natural or additives or preservatives that could add to the fishy smell that usually people like in seafood products. Again, from a cost perspective or from a functionality perspective, any key insights you could throw here, Sonia?
Well, there are some microalgae that bring this fishiness that we are talking about. So it's something that you can explore. We haven't explored it like a lot, but we have chosen like maybe 3 types, and each one of them is very different. So all of them bring fishiness, but it's different in each case, right? And well, it's something that you can explore. I invite you to just go and develop these prototypes and start playing with as many ingredients as possible. But it's something like that needs a lot of development, right? And it's very open. As Varun was saying, there is an open space now, and you just can like check what's in the market in terms of ingredients that are currently available. And then also keep an eye open, because I'm sure that in the next year and a half, new novel ingredients will show up, and it's just a matter of waiting for them to be available and being aware and talking with the suppliers about new things to come, etc., etc. And also, I invite you to talk a lot with chefs, with restaurants, and see what they normally use in their traditional recipes. But don't misconsider that, because sometimes we are like, because we are scientists, no? and we have to, and it's a good thing, but don't misconsider chefs, I don't know, grandma's recipes. Sometimes you find a lot of good insights and you learn a lot from these recipes.
Yeah, Jen, you also put in Pisces project, and would you like to just quickly give some context around that so that people can explore that link a little better?
Yeah, so I mentioned in the chat that this is an early version of a tool, but it's something that we're putting out new versions of every month or so. And it's just a database of a bunch of sort of seafood relevant species and characterization data on them. So I would recommend just clicking into it. There's a user guide linked there, and you can see what kind of information we have. Something that I think is really helpful is we have a whole section of relevant papers on different species, so you can really dig into some of the characteristics of each species by kind of getting right into the literature there. But we've pulled a lot of the data out as well, and we're consistently adding to that and adding sort of new angles on how to look at that data. So I would keep checking back.
Awesome. And I'll just take 10 more minutes. I know we're kind of running out of time, but just because we started a little late, we're just going to stay 10 more minutes to ensure that we cover some more questions. I think there's an interesting question here about, seafood usually is considered, there's at least a notion that it's very specific to each region and each market, like Norwegian salmon or Pacific salmon, and usually a lot of different regions consume very specific seafood. So does that really mean that for plant-based seafood, there's a limitation when it comes to export opportunities? And would most of the companies end up serving the local market? Just some lights around that. Varun or Jen?
I can start. I think it depends on the product you're interested in, the market you're in, and sort of what you want that reach to look like. I think there is a huge amount of opportunity for sort of more locally focused products to be really successful within their market. But I think for the most part, obviously, if you want to do something on a global scale, then having a product that can be, either adapted to different sort of consumer preferences, or that is fairly common across a lot of different regions is obviously an advantage. But I think there's there's room for whatever the interest is. So if there's, you know, if you're doing something really well with a product that is not eaten around the world, then, you know, think about sort of how far you want to expand. And if you do, how to adapt that product, or to take certain sort of parts of your process and apply them to things that are eaten elsewhere. I think that for the most part, I don't expect, and Sònia had kind of alluded to this when talking about sort of choosing the product to focus on, that there is an advantage to producing plant-based products that do kind of mimic the experience that people are used to, and that they have this sort of nostalgia and familiarity around, and trying a completely new species in a plant-based format might, at least when the plant-based seafood space is new, kind of turn people off because they're looking for that familiarity. And so much of the standard that we hold plant-based products to is how familiar is it to me and how much does it taste like the conventional product. So I think to an extent there is that limitation, but there are, you know, so many globally traded seafood products. It's a massive global commodity. So I think there's still a lot of opportunity, or if you want to focus on one region, I think that could be a really cool project. You just have to think about how to adapt if you want to go global.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that it's kind of interesting in India, in much of the country, seafood is a behavior that is yet to be learned. So if you look at the North Indian belt, that is not as connected to the coasts. Seafood is essentially imported into that region, right? And in fact, because we don't have fantastic internal infrastructure in cold chain and frozen supply chain, it has not been imported into that region or transported to that region in the volumes that you might expect. And so people are still kind of learning about seafood, and that behavior is still evolving. As everyone who's listening probably knows, there are companies now that are specialized that are doing these kinds of supply chains just for seafood and just for other types of meat. So you've seen Licious, you've seen Fresh to Home, you've seen Meatigo. These are companies that deliver meat, and they've built their entire supply chain, their entire chilled and frozen supply chain. In the case of Fresh to Home, they're only focusing on seafood. And so you can bet that there's possibly a generation of people in New Delhi and other places in North India that are learning about seafood by ordering it on Fresh to Home. So I think there is a possibility to educate customers and create category awareness about a product that is new to them, but you'll have to somehow root it in the familiar. And I would I would encourage folks to go back and look at the webinar that Raji and Dhruvi did a couple of days ago on how to position and how to think about rooting or marrying the familiar with the novel, and lots of really interesting insights there. I mean, so Sonia's company is going through Y Combinator right now, right? And the major insight from Y Combinator, if we had to distill down like the theory at Y Combinator, it is make stuff people want. Obviously, in terms of figuring out what that means to different people, and then allying it with your potential cost basis and your technology and all of that stuff, that's much more complex, but it has to stem from making stuff that people want.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That is the key. It's making something that people want, because otherwise you will not sell it. So, and then it's also about choosing what's your market, right? Because maybe, I don't know, I'm thinking of Spain, for instance. I don't know if you are familiar with ham, the dry ham that it's very typical and famous in Spain. So everybody eats a lot of that product in Spain, but then it's only there, only in Spain. So it depends on the cost that your product will have. So choosing this market, maybe you can just plan to sell in Spain, for instance, or in a particular, in some cities in India, I don't know, it's choosing that and then constructing your business plan around that. And if it makes sense and people want it, then you just have to make it happen.
Got it. I think we have one question each we can go, so if anybody wants to pick a question from the Q&A section, feel free to. Otherwise, I can pick them.
I can answer the question on GM ingredients. This is easily answered. GM ingredients are not allowed in food, and therefore it would not be allowed in the plant-based seafood industry in India. That was the easiest question I've answered in some time. I think we lost Shardul, but Jen, do you want to pick any of these questions? I think Sonia, you may be able to answer questions about how the color of seafood changes when it's fried and when it's cooked, and are there any, are people doing anything about that?
Okay, yeah, I was going to answer one question that was about how we make it during this year and a half to have end customers and consumers tasting the product and the prototypes. So I'm gonna take this one first, if it's okay. And well, it's something that, for instance, we have been working at a place that it's the Impact Hub. I'm sure that you have similar places there. And there you have a net, right? And you talk with people, and then in our case, the friends of some people that were working there were very suitable to our buyer persona, so our market people, the target that we were interested in. And so it was a matter of inviting them come to tastings and asking them for feedback. That's how we managed to do it. And also partnering or having collaborations with restaurants, in our case, that can be potentially customers for you, but then during this process also can bring a lot of feedback, insights, also from their chefs, like they can tell you if the product is good enough or not, or what's missing or what's wrong. And then also they can, if they think that the product is fine, then they can be open to the tastings at their restaurant. And I think it's a matter of finding a way to collaborate with other parties and doing this synergy, right? Because maybe the thing that you will be doing your tasting at their restaurant will mean a lot to them, because you will attract new customers to the restaurant. And also it's good for you because you will receive a lot of feedback, and you will start this communication and this relationship with the restaurant that will be a potential customer for you. So that's, I think, a good way of finding these tasters.
Makes a lot of sense. I think we're almost hitting a time limit. So we can take one question if anybody wants to pick. Otherwise, we'll just close the webinar with some ending remarks. Awesome. I think we can take some of the other questions offline. And one key thing that I want to mention, actually, I ran a quick poll on both sessions, and almost 85% of the people attending found the webinar very, very useful. Especially because, like I was telling Jen earlier, like a lot of these insights are kind of missing. Even simple Google searches don't return a lot of insights on a lot of key areas. So I'm sure that today's webinar, where we contextualized a lot of the global insights with local insights, science and development, process, scale up. I think we touched a lot of points, and these are going to be very helpful for all the attendees. So thank you so much, for joining us today, both Sonia and Jen, taking out time to educate our participants on the plant-based seafood category. And I'm sure that very exciting proposals in this category are going to come for us, and we'll be very happy to share the results for phase 3 with you as and when we know them. Thank you so much for having the time for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you, Sonia. Take care. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.